Welcome to episode 9 of my narrative inquiry, What Does It Mean to Be Acadian? With Nova Scotia Acadian and author Susan Surette-Draper. In this episode, we talk about her book and what it means to be an Acadian in her generation.
Suzanne, can you tell us about yourself, where you grew up, and where you're currently living now?
Okay. It's Susan, not Suzanne. Although I love the sound of Suzanne, my parents gave me a nice, easy English name, and so just plain Susan is me. And I grew up in Yarmouth County, which is in a small village called Lower Eel Brook, and it is part of what we call a Parent Bas, which is really different from Parent Haut, which is the Clare district. So if you looked on a map, I'm in the Argyll district. Basically, you have Yarmouth, and then it's the dividing line between the two Acadian communities, Parent Bas and Parent Haut, so Clare and Argyll. So just a little geography on that. Yes, that's where I grew up, and I left the village to go to university, and never really lived there after. But I am now in Port Williams, which is about 15 minutes away from Grand Pré National Historic Site, just on the other side of the river. So that's where I am as far as where I live and where I come from.
So, can you tell us a bit about what you do for a living and a bit about your history as well? I know that you're a published author, so if you could share a little bit about that as well.
Yes, I am. I didn't start out being a writer, although I always enjoyed writing. But there's always more imperatives when you're young. You have to get a job that you pays and all of that. And I went to university. I took a business course. I worked in retailing. Then I worked for the phone company. And my third career, I worked at Grand Pré as a guide, which really taught me all kinds of things that I thought I already knew or I thought were unknowable. I had grown up in a village, well, of course, in Nova Scotia, all the Acadian villages are on my side of Nova Scotia, as opposed to the Clare side, where you have all the villages one after another. On the Argyll side, there are Acadian villages interspersed with Anglophone villages, interspersed with Acadians. So they're not mixed together, but they're one next to each other. And of course, in order to do any kind of business, etc., then one would need to be bilingual, at least bilingual. So, and everything happened in Yarmouth, the banking, etc. So I grew up in that reality, whereas and school taught us that in order to go out in the real world and be any kind of success, then you must master English better than Anglophones themselves. So that was the message from school. We spoke French, of course, in my village, at home. It's my first language, all of that. But as far as schooling, our French schooling was, well, basically, most people today recognize core French as a word. That's a kind of course, core French. Basically, that's what we had for French as far as learning how to write it, the grammar, the literature. We didn't have any more than any of the Anglophones throughout the province of Nova Scotia. In fact, we had the same exams, the provincial exams at the time. So it was a very low bar, and it didn't really teach us much about the French language. The message we got in school about the French language was it was something that you do at home, but it really has no other value. So, of course, I'm in the school system in the 1950s and 60s. And so at that point, that was the message. So, yeah, so when I worked at Grand Pré, as far as writing the book, when I worked at Grand Pré, I learned that there was all sorts of things that we had not been told in school, not been told in our communities, and that we had just simply assumed was not knowable. Any questions were like everything was burnt. Yes, we are Acadians, but we were not deported. That was a common theme. But there was never more information on that. And so it made you kind of worry or wonder if, are we really Acadians? Because all you ever hear about Acadians, even if you hear very little about Acadians, is that they were deported. And so if you're not deported, then is there something to be ashamed of? Or what? How did that even happen? So it was all those unanswered questions that by the time I started working in Grand Pre, which is the late 1990s, I found when I got there that in the meantime, since I had been in school, there had been historians who had found new documents. There had been archaeologists who had dug up all kinds of information. And there was more and more information coming out all the time. And so I, as part of working at Grand Pre, at one point there was a plan that we would pick a person in history and then be that person for the visitors, tell the story from their point of view type of thing. And so I decided to pick my ancestor, Catherine Bro, who was married to Pierre Surette, and tell her story, because she was in the right time span. She had lived in the valley, in the Canard area, where is basically where I live now. So I recognize her landscape. She had survived the deportation and ended up in Yarmouth County with Pierre and their family. I knew that much. So I wanted someone who had survived the whole thing. So, but the program at Grand Pre just died off. But by then I was already thinking of seeing the world through her eyes. So we had winters off, so I took some writing courses at Acadia University, and it seemed like writing her story was the story I should be writing about. So I started writing bits and pieces as I found them, as I researched, as I read, and ultimately it ended up, after a long time, 20 years, to be a book. And my teacher at Acadia said, "This is a book. Don't put it in a drawer and forget about it." Because the thing I realized she was right, because in the class that I took at Acadia, every chapter I read, people in the class were wanting more. It was something they didn't know. Our story is not about the deportation in particular. I mean, it happens all around them, but their story, they're not deported. And so it was totally unknown to people who even knew a tiny bit about the Acadians and thought it all had to do with the deportation. And I wrote it as a novel. You can see it behind me. It's called Refuge. And I wrote it in English, naturally, because I just explained to you why my French language education was lacking. And even though, I can read French and I can write you an email in French, I can read a book in French. I can do an interview in French, but as far as writing a novel, that's a whole other skill. So, and the other reason why I was happy to write it in English is that I know that there's a ton of Acadians who do not speak French. And when I worked at Grand Pre, I realized that if a book came out, or even if we had brochures, you would have, if you had 100, you might pass out brochures, 75 of them. If you had 100 of each, so you would 75 of the written ones in English would pass. People would take them, and then at the end of the day, you would have 75 left over of the French ones. So it taught me that anything written in French is wonderful for the people who can still read it. But not only are there Cajuns who don't read French, there's a lot of Acadians in my village, in generally all over Nova Scotia, who have lost their language just for one reason or another, and who currently read in English. So I thought, I have a story that is not well known, and I want as many people as possible to know it. So having written it in English made sense on that score.
Forgot I was muted there. That definitely makes sense to, your target audience and who's going to, those that are interested in it are going to read it. Even Acadians that speak French would still read the English book to get the information. So
probably a few people, particularly the ones in France, who don't really speak very much English, would like a French version. And there are some Quebecois who don't read English as well. But on the whole, I'd say writing in English for Acadians in the Maritimes is not a problem. Most Acadians in the Maritimes will be able to read it. Yeah. And I didn't want my target audience to be just Acadians, because I think living here in the Valley, I know that people want to know this story. They want to know more. And I wrote it as a novel. So a novel is much more accessible than a history book. And I'm finding lots of people who aren't Acadians who are appreciating the book for what it teaches them and in the way that it teaches them, from the point of view of people who actually lived through all of this. So it's working on that level, not, like I say, not just for Acadians, but primarily for Acadians. I primarily wrote it for the Surettes from home, because it's a story we don't know and we should know. And so after that, all of the other groups just fell into place as, yes, a story that should be told.
So I have a few questions for you. And the first one is, what does it mean to be Acadian?
Okay, that's always an interesting question with many sides. And like I say, I was a guide at Grand Pre for almost 15 years. So it's one of those questions that you would get. And it's very nuanced. At Grand Pre, for instance, we have the bronze plaques that have the Acadian family names. So usually people who identify as Acadian have some kind of link to those names. They may be Anglophone for the last 6 generations, but they'll tell you, oh, my grandmother was a LeBlanc. All right, there's some kind of connection to the Acadians through their family names and through the time that they established themselves in Acadie. You would rarely find someone who had absolutely no connection who would say, I'm Acadian. So for me, even though I know that there's, it can be controversial, but for me, it sort of spins around the family names, one way or the other. Maybe you don't wear that name today, but it's somewhere in your family tree, and that gives you that connection. So for me, anyone who would tell me my great 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 grandmother was a LeBlanc means that they're automatically Acadian. I would say, well, that's it. You're one of us. Welcome, and you're a cousin. And so to me, it's that broad. It doesn't matter if you speak English or French or Spanish or whatever. If you have that connection to Acadie, to the first families who call themselves Acadians, or the families that came later but became intertwined into the Acadian community. I mean, there are people who, Anglophones or Irish or whatever, who married Acadian girls. Well, that works too for me. I'm not looking just the patrilineal line. If whatever the connection is, that you feel you're connected to it, then that's fine. I mean, we don't have a territory. There's no quiz for becoming an Acadian. You don't have all of the rules and regulations you might have for a state, an actual territory. So you can be quite open about it all. Anyone who wants to be part of your family, well, you welcome them.
So would you say that this feeling that you have in regards to this question, your answer, is it different than it would have been in your childhood?
Well, when I was a child and growing up, no one called themselves Acadian. So that was a totally a term that no one used. Basically, in my village, we were the French in my village, and the people in the next village in Glenwood were the English. So we were the French, even though we were Acadians, and they were the English, even though they're planters. So they're the descendants of the New England planters. So we just cut it right down to English and French. So I'm sorry, what was the question again?
Was your childhood belief of what an Acadian is different than what it is now?
Oh, I never really thought about it, to be honest. It just was. And there was no, and once we went to school, there was really not any other useful information to define us. So we were the French, they were the English. That's it. That's all.
So
We knew who we were related to, who our villages were, how we were different from one Acadian village to the next, maybe in language or pronunciation or location. But it was just a kind of never quite defined. It was just there.
So, would you have said that you're, at what point would you have identified as being an Acadian, since it wasn't something that you identified necessarily with as a child? You just
Yeah.
identified
Well,
as French and English.
yes, basically. I mean, I went to university in Halifax, so it was all in English, and there were people there from everywhere. And so I was a maritimer. I was from Nova Scotia. I was from Yarmouth County. And after university, I went to Toronto. And the further away you get, the larger your box. So when I lived in Toronto, I was a maritimer. That was big enough for them to understand. No one would have known where Lower Eelbrook is, and Nova Scotia might have been tough for them to find on a map for some of them. So, you just live your life, and being an Acadian really had no particular part in any of it until I moved back to Nova Scotia with my husband, and we ended up here in the valley. And so it sort of coincided with more information coming out on Acadians in general, the history of it. And then the CMA, the Congrès Mondial, started happening. And so that sort of awakened curiosity and pride, I guess, in being an Acadian or an identity. So I'd say it's around that time that I became more curious. And then living in this landscape, too, just being here, I would drive around and I'd say, these are the dikes. The Acadians were in the Grand Pre area. I wonder if there's my story is here. So being here, and then at the same time as more information and more Congrès Mondial are happening, that sort of thing, it becomes more real to me.
So the more that it became in your aware in your everyday life, it had a stronger presence.
Yes, I have just a little anecdote on because I guess we just we didn't think about it, we didn't rationalize it, we didn't anything. When the Congrès Mondial happened in Nova Scotia in 2004, um, my father came to visit from Yarmouth County, and I drove him to Grand Pre because the new building was there and all of that. And at the time, Grand Pre was really um, decked out in their Acadian colors. There was a big flag in flowers on the hill, and people had hung Acadian flags on the route into Grand Pre. And my father said, why are all these flags out? They're not Acadian. And so to just be received that way was totally foreign to him. Like he had been, he's a World War II generation. And for him, being French was never a plus or rarely ever a plus. And so he had encountered way more discrimination than I had in my generation. And so for him to see the Acadian flags, the Acadian presence there accepted and shown was shocking to him, because that was the polar opposite to his growing up and life afterwards. So he was seeing a transition too, and for him it was unbelievable, nice, but surprising.
Yeah, definitely would have been shocking, I imagine, for someone to all of a sudden have, with this popularity, like that
Yeah,
was never there
exactly.
before.
All of a sudden it became popular to be Acadian
Yeah,
during the Congrès Mondial. I mean, he knew that. I mean, he'd been to Grand Pré before. He used to take us when we were kids, and we'd walk on the grounds and all of that without much knowing. So there was a sense of being Acadian, but then that's not. It doesn't become a historic site until the 60s. So still, it's there. It's boiling around, but it's not a in your face thing until it becomes Congrès Mondial time or that sort of thing really pushed it, even for us. I mean, we're in Nova Scotia, there's only like 4% of the population that's Acadian. So we're not in any kind of position like New Brunswick is, where you have almost 40%. And we're not a bilingual province, and we are basically easily forgotten. And so yes, so for us to be recognized is surprising and shocking.
yeah. But I'm sure it was a really good experience.
Yes.
So my next question, and I think you kind of already answered it, but I'm going to ask it anyway. Are English Acadians less Acadian due to assimilation?
No, every Acadian is an Acadian. I don't have. I really don't like that idea of people who say you have to speak French to be Acadian. I think that's absolutely terrible. I absolutely disagree with that idea. Um, I have met over my years at Grand Pré in particular lots of people who come up to me and are even more proud Acadians than the ones who live in Acadian villages and speak French every day. And so certainly having the language and understanding the language and all the nuance of the language is a great addition. It helps you to read documents. It helps you to speak to people from each language quite easily. And it helps you at family reunions or reunions. You can be, being bilingual is perfect. Being only French is a hindrance, because then you can't talk to the rest of your family because 75% of them are only speaking English. And so it's a hindrance to only have one language either way. But the Acadians that are Anglophones and were brought up that way, and there's all kinds of heartbreaking reasons why, other than just practicality, like you need a job. You have the stories of the people who were punished, like famously the Louisianans always have that story. But in my background at home, where we were surrounded by the Anglophones, then people were discriminated against for jobs and all of that sort of thing. So I mean, there were reasons why. In particular in Yarmouth, you run into a lot of, that's the town close to us, you would run into lots of Acadians who moved to Yarmouth who could speak French perfectly fine in their village, but they didn't speak French to their kids. They spoke only English in town because they wanted their kids to do well, and they wanted them to move on and not be punished or held back because they were speaking French or even had an accent. So people did it for whatever practical reasons, for jobs. Sometimes they were only hiring English people. So if you're a LeBlanc, you might just as well be a white so you can get a job. So there were all kinds of reasons why people didn't continue with the French. The other reason, at home in particular, is because of the French that we spoke, which is not the standard French. Of course, it has a basis in standard French, but we're still using pronunciations from the old French, from France, from the 1600s, that we still use because we were all isolated in our little boxes. So we still use the words that we use, that our grandparents had used, and so we didn't even know what the real standard French word was for things. So even for us to speak to our kids, we were uncomfortable doing that because we thought we're just going to mix them up. Now they're going to learn standard French in school. We're going to be speaking in our language, in our words, in our rhythm of French that is going to be different to them. So again, it's the kind of the thing where you know, your parents, and you do the best for your kids and you prepare them as much as you can, but you don't want to hinder them with the French that you speak, which, by the way, in my school, we were all told are vous parlez mal. So you're not speaking well. I know that there's a show coming up on CBC or Radio Canada, I think this weekend, that's what it's called, parler mal. And so parler mal is a word, definitely a term that we would hear even in school, even from our teachers, who were, most of them, Acadians themselves, who could speak French and spoke French the way we did in our villages. So when you have all of that against you, you can see why people become, okay, if I can't speak well in French and you're not going to teach me how to do it properly, then I'm going to speak English. But the English books are fine. The culture all around us is English. So it's totally accessible. So why people only speak English is a loss, and it's a shame, and it keeps, I know that sometimes I deal with genealogists, and they're frustrated that, you know, an old book written by a priest in the 1600s they can't read because it's all in French. And then if you're bilingual, then you can read it, you can translate it, you can understand it. And so it's a loss. But it's not, it doesn't mean you don't qualify. I absolutely disagree with that. I know I've heard people say that it's all about the language, but I absolutely refute that.
So you kind of covered this a little bit in answering the question. My next question to you is, do you feel that you had fewer opportunities as an Acadian?
That's a good question. I thought about it quite a while. And honestly, I don't know if it had to do with being Acadian or being a woman, because I think either one of those things could have been hindrances at one point or another for jobs or positions or anything. So I possibly I did master English, so I can speak it and write it and all of that. So as far as the language, I have an accent. I'm proud of my accent, and I have no desire to get rid of it. But it may have rubbed a few people the wrong way, but it didn't keep me from doing a job in English. So I think you always run into dinosaurs who are still are threatened by either a woman or someone who can speak two languages, or, you know, the French, because you get the blowback from whatever's happening in I don't know, New Brunswick or Quebec or wherever. And if you manifest yourself with an Acadian accent, then they automatically think you're the enemy. So I'm sure that has happened, but I can't really think of too many times that I could specifically say it was because I was Acadian. Might have more often been because I was a woman. uh, but I have to say, thinking about it, it made me realize that there's been lots of times when it's been a good thing that I'm Acadian. I find I understood, first of all, working at Grand Prix as a guide, because you meet people from all over the world, and they'll tell you their stories, which often have to do with deportations and dislocations and all of that, and where they are today, or how they still fight those battles, or how they're still unsettled, and how Acadians have been lucky enough, well, we in Canada have been lucky enough to be in Canada, in a country that doesn't necessarily make us want us to be all in the melting pot and be only one thing. We have all these cultures, and and I felt proud to be Acadian there, because it's like, we have been here all along, and we're still here, and we're part of this mosaic. And for people who are particularly new to Canada, who have come from God knows what terrible things, I felt like we can be an example of how you can still be what you are. You can work and compromise and deal with what happens. It's never easy. It's always messy. But in the end, you can be living in a country that most immigrants come for, a safe place where they can, their kids can have a future and they can live in peace. And so if the Acadian story can teach you, or at least tell you that it's possible here, then I think that's amazing as a message. So I think otherwise, sometimes because I'm Acadian, I get treated as if I'm exotic or particularly interesting, because I don't live in a French community at all. It's all Anglophone around here, except there's tons of Acadians but we're all kind of incognito in the valley. You'll hear French conversations between two people, and I know lots of Acadians who do speak French, but when we're out and about in our regular thing, we're all Anglophones to the rest of the world. So being different and exotic is kind of interesting. Our foods are different. Our ethnic foods like la rapure and all of that are our things. So we're part of this mix. So I find sometimes people, I can tell by the look on their face that they're enjoying the accent. I'm here in the valley and close to Wolfville. So Wolfville is, although it's a little valley town, it's quite cosmopolitan because of the university, and not just the people in the university, but there's quite a bit of a retirement community around this area, and often they have a link to the university. They came here, they fell in love here, they worked, they got married here, they worked all over the world, and when it came time to retire, they're here. So it's kind of a different kind of small town, and so it brings in people from everywhere. So they appreciate it. They want to know more. They like the cadence of my particular accent, which is, of course, different than a Quebecois accent or even a New Brunswick accent. So it's still French, but it sounds a bit different. So there's that. I think being Acadian and Francophone, probably at the heart of it, is that I often will be have a different point of view than people who were brought up totally Anglophone. It might be more emotional. It might be just not as rigid in English as an Anglophone person might. And so I find I like that. I like to, but I'm Acadian, so I like to, stir the pot a little. So I'm always glad to get a reaction. And so sometimes, and I think it comes from the French background, that Anglophones are more straight up, and if you throw in a curveball, then it makes the whole thing more interesting. The other thing is, I love being an outsider. So I think that I love the perspective of being an outsider. So I'm happy to live in an Anglophone community and to be the Acadian, so that if I don't know, CBC wants to do an interview, Radio Canada, I should say, and they want to speak to an Acadian, and it's the winter and the Parks Canada is all closed, then they'll probably call me because nobody else is kind of s'affiche pas. They're not talking about being Acadians, even though there's lots of Acadians here. And so, and I think being an outsider too, not living in my community, my birth community anymore, gave me a good perspective to write my book, because I think it's interesting to step back to see things a little more globally than if you're right in something. So I do like, I like the idea of being an outsider, and I like being receiving the world and telling them about the Acadian history and how it matches theirs in some ways, or how we have things in common, or the world is really not that big. And I find being here gives me that opportunity, because visitors come often to Grand Pre, and they visit Grand Pre. It's a historic site, and they get the global idea of the Acadians. But my group, the Amis de Grand Pre, we've gotten into this. We've been contacted by tour groups in particular, and sometimes just generally people who come to visit and say, well, this is all very nice in Grand Pre, but my family was in Pisiquid, which is Windsor today, or Rivière-au-Canard, which is the Canard area. Can you show me? So our group, the Amis de Grand Pre, will give tours. And so we take them to, as much as possible, where their ancestors were, or where they were deported from, or wherever their contact point is. And that's very gratifying. That's very special, not just for the people who have come from, God knows, France or Louisiana or Quebec, to be able to take them to the spot where their ancestors lived before they were deported, is quite, those are unforgettable experiences. And so for us, and then of course being bilingual, even though my French was very, very, very rusty when I was employed at Grand Pre, because I had been living and working and studying in English only for the last 15 years of my life. Working at Grand Pre, you have to be bilingual, and so I was. So it really, and working for Grand Pre really turned my life around in lots of ways. So it's been a blessing for me.
So you've kind of touched on this, and I'm kind of feel like I might know your answer, but I'm going to ask anyway. Have you had any barriers, do you feel, because of language issues in your life or in your career?
No, I've always lived and worked in English, and so I took my French was so rusty that I took courses at Acadie University to brush up on it. So, but it was only a barrier kind of to me. And when I started working at Grand Pre, my lack of, I was getting uncomfortable in French because I was using it so very little. So, but I found it was something that I wanted to get better. So so my French was really, the fact that I could speak French never held me back, because everything all the places I worked, etc., were always in English, except for Grand Pre. And then my French wasn't good enough. So I had to work to bring it up to a level where it would be where I would be comfortable doing presentations and writing things, etc., reading reports. So no, I was never so good in French that it held me back. Let's just say, if that's what your question is.
Yeah.
But that's because I wasn't, I mean, I didn't apply for a job at the University of Moncton either. I mean, so that would have been a problem. But that wasn't my career path. So um, it didn't matter.
Yeah, so you were happy to continue your education in English. It wouldn't have been something that stopped you from pursuing your education.
Yeah, I preferred it. In school, we were taught that you should, like I said, you should know English backwards and forwards and better than Anglophone anywhere. So yes, it was all part of the whole thing about going out into the world. One must be perfectly fluent in English. And the idea at the time when I was in high school in the 60s, um, it was still, French is just going to hold you back. It's just going to keep you in that little ghetto that your parents had tried so hard to claw out of to make a good life for themselves. And it it was probably not the same for every family and every village and all of that. But in my community, um, that's the message I got. That going to University St. Anne's or Moncton would have just been a way to say, I'm staying in this box. I'm not going to claw out of it. And so for me, no, I did it as an adult. I got more proficient in French. But at the time I was a student, no, this is before, the official bilingualism and all of this stuff, which changed our lives so fundamentally. Uh, I must say, just that it became not a hindrance, but a plus. It wasn't that when I was in school. So we just saw it as a hindrance.
So what would you say has been your biggest challenge as an Acadian?
Um, I don't know. I don't think I can't think of a particular thing that has challenged me in my life that I could attribute to the fact that I was Acadian. I mean, I think maybe when I was in high school trying to get those little summer jobs, um, they weren't forthcoming so much for Acadian kids. Um, that's probably true. Um, Yarmouth is very Anglophone, and it was forever. So there were biases, definitely. Uh, but my family wasn't poor either. So we, and we could speak English. So we could get through it, right? And so we didn't run up against in your face kind of discrimination. I mean, it was understood that you would be discriminated against because you were French, but it wasn't. I can't really think of right off the top of my head, or I have been thinking about it. I can't. Nothing comes to mind as a particular reason that being Acadian was a bad thing.
You don't have any moments that impacted your life in a negative way then, so that's good.
Well, that I lots of moments, but not that I can attribute to being Acadian
Yeah,
in particular. I think being a woman is harder.
yeah, it definitely has its own challenges for sure. Um,
Yes.
so I really appreciate you taking the time this evening to answer my questions and to add to my narrative inquiry so that I have some additional research to go through. I'm not sure exactly when I'm going to be going through all of these interviews that I'm collecting. I'm in the very first
Yes.
stages of my research, so I'm just doing interviews with folks right now. And sometime I imagine in the new year, I'll be kind of deciding what I'm going to do with all of the research, but it's based on those questions that we discussed. So I'll be,
It's
compiling.
going to be quite a, I'm sure it will be that quite different from people in Nova Scotia from my generation than people in Nova Scotia from who are younger than me.
Mhm.
And even in Nova Scotia, as opposed to New Brunswick, is always a startling difference to me. Every time I go to Moncton, I feel like I've walked into the two solitudes still today. And I know that there's more language friction in New Brunswick. Obviously, it's next door. And recently, someone has said to me, um, someone from New Brunswick who has been in Nova Scotia for extended periods of time, and they could see that the friction that exists in New Brunswick is not here, and his reasoning is, which I agree with, is that we're not threatening at all. We're just the Acadians, and we do our own thing, and we are exotic and interesting and colorful and musical and all of that. We're only 4% of the population. But in New Brunswick, there's more of you. It's more of a threat. And I can see how that works. But in Nova Scotia, you can be Acadian and not run into too many barriers as long as you can function in English, right? But
Yeah.
it doesn't affect your Acadianness.
I find myself, I've spent my whole life trying to figure out what the perfect Acadian is. And I didn't identify with the perfect Acadian. Therefore, I'm not Acadian enough to be Acadian. And I was always too English for the French and too French for the English, and not, being bilingual wasn't necessarily, it wasn't a bad thing, but it didn't make me more Acadian. It would maybe make me even less Acadian to some people because I, became assimilated. And my mom, her last name is Savoy. So they assimilated, I believe it was three generations, would have been three generations back. But my great grandfather Samuel's, it was Savoy, married a Protestant woman and became Savoy. So right then and there, he had been kicked out of the community and became English. So my mother
Yes.
never identified as Acadian, which just confused me so much because it gave me this idea that, or left me with the impression that English isn't good enough to, if you're English, you're not good enough to be an Acadian, right? And it was just,
No,
I
other
always
way.
had I always had this torn, conflicting feeling, right? But I know that now as an adult and through growing up, essentially, that that's not true. But for her to
And
hold on to that.
Hmm. In Nova Scotia, we're not as dogmatic about it as you are in New Brunswick. So we don't have the qualifications, tick, tick, tick. But the other thing before you go, I wanted to, you asked me about the words or the terms
Yes, if you
that are
have
different.
any unique slang or sayings or just even a words that you use that's still archaic or something, it's, yeah, anything.
I didn't mean to cut you off, but I wanted to say it before before you went because I just remembered it. Um, so I'm from Yarmouth County, and we're in the Argyll section. So in particular, the Pubnicos, which are just down the road from my village, um, they're of course very proud to say they're the descendants of Philip Muse d'Entremont, who was a baron, and what Charles de la Tour gave him the title. All of that. But and in particular in Pubnico, but also in the rest of Haut-en-Bas, you will hear people saying 70, 80, and 90. And that is 70, 80, and 90 when you count. And so, which is very much more sensible than if you go, if you go in French and you're counting 50, 60, now you have to go do some math. 70, 80, 90. But if you do it in Pubnico, you do 50, 60, 70, 80, 90. So that's 50, 60, 70, 80, 90. So it's still the aunt, it's still the same idea as 50 and 60, which everybody agrees on still. So those are things that are particular to us. And I must say it's much easier. I'm still having trouble with 60, 16, and I'm like, in my head, I have to do the math to come up with 76, which is a lot easier. So that is kind of particular to our part in Southwest Nova Scotia. That really, the thing is, where Philip Muse d'Entremont, the first guy, really came from is still a mystery to genealogists. He's kind of a mysterious guy, but today we receive new Francophone immigrants from all over the world. And we find that the people from Belgium totally understand 70, 80, and 90, because they still use it there. So if you're on YouTube and you're watching a thing in French from Belgium, you will, even on the news reports, etc., you'll hear them using that way of counting. So it's always, for us, it was always, oh, some old thing, get rid of it. But it turns out the Belgians really love to hear it, and they totally understand it. So, and that's an interesting little bit of the language that's different. Otherwise, I am from a fishing community, and my father was a carpenter, like half the 3/4 of the men in the village. So there are terms that they use that are from ancient France, because of course we were very isolated for hundreds of years. And so English, yes, was English, and it kept changing, but French was still the French of our ancestors who had come in the 1600s. So yes, we still have, in fact, Yves Cormier just put out a dictionnaire recently, and he had visited Southwest Nova Scotia, and he determined that of all the places in Acadie, we are the ones that are speaking the most authentic to the ancient French than anybody. And really, I think it's because of the isolation. But we still have words and terms and terminology that were common in French. And so when people come from France, they'll say, oh, your accent is familiar to me. You sound like my grandma. Or if we use a word that is common to us, they'll say, I haven't heard that word since my grandmother used it. So it's kind of fun when you get those links and connections. And that's sort of one of the sad things about the people who can't speak French anymore. They miss the flavor of those words and what they mean and the connection to our history here. I mean, it doesn't disqualify you. It's just a piece that's missing. It's like you can live a whole life and never be a parent, and you still have a wonderful life. But if you're a parent, you have an extra piece. And so it's kind of like that.
Yeah, and there's so many little pockets of language where the language was kept because of isolation. So it's interesting to hear the different sayings from all the different regions. I hope that language finds a way to stay alive in those regions, and that folks are still,
It's hard. Yeah, it's diluting fast. I mean, the young kids today, well, everybody's online everywhere. I know that Quebec is always worrying about this thing about how their kids are learning English online and everything is happening. So you hear, well, I mean, Radio Canada, TV, radio mainly focuses on Quebec, so you know what they're thinking about more. But I'd say it's something that people, francophone communities everywhere, are noticing, that their kids are just getting better and better in English, and they're kind of like where I was in the 60s in high school, where you think, oh, it's nice to speak French to my grandma, but it's not going to get me a job or make me a citizen of the world. So it's
Yeah,
always that.
it was very difficult because when I was in high school, was in a French, I went through French education, but then I switched over to English because I knew what I wanted to pursue. There was no options in French college, French university. So why would I continue to pursue that? And so I switched over all my education into English to make it easier for me when I was making that transition into the higher worlds, of academia. And for a very long time, I left French behind. And it wasn't until someone um, basically asked me, like, are you bilingual? There's a job for a bilingual person. And I'm like, yeah, I can speak French.
Yeah,
But and everything
valuable
kind
at
of,
some.
and I ended up working in the New Brunswick Heart Center and meeting Acadians and French individuals from all over the Maritimes and from Maine sometimes as well. They would come for heart surgery, but all the different dialects that I was picking up
Yeah.
and the different
Yes.
ways of speaking. And I learned very quickly that, standard French didn't work in a lot of cases. I had to speak the language of the patient or, the family members that were coming in. And it was interesting. I could switch between, I was comfortable enough in my French at the time to be able to switch. Now I don't, I was speaking French every day then. So that is the huge difference.
Oh,
Whereas
it's
now,
all about, sure. It is
yeah,
all about practice. So yes, that is a thing. But that's one of the other questions that people always ask. Recently, I was at a thing in Wolfville, and there was a film, and it was in French with subtitles, and of course, it was a documentary. So they had Cajuns and New Brunswick Acadians, and I was in it for a period and all of that. And we were all, and someone asked the question again about French and the different accents, and how there's always someone who says, well, I'm from Quebec and I don't understand any of those Acadian accents. And I love the answer that the filmmaker answered. He said, have you been to Newfoundland? And so, I was always a little more diplomatic when I was at Grand Pre. I'd say, I'm sure that if you go to Liverpool, England, or Texas, or Newfoundland, then they're all going to be speaking to you in English. But you're going to have to fine tune your ears to really work your way, because it's not an accent or a turn of phrase that you recognize, but they're all speaking English. So we are all speaking French. It's different. It's
yeah.
more interesting than all speaking standard French.
I think the most interesting French I ever had the opportunity to listen to was French when I was in Newfoundland. I went when I was in grade 12 for a Acadie Jeunesse. We had like a get together of all of the provinces in the Maritimes, and I think every year they would pick like a different province. So it was in St. John's, and there was folks from all over, and it was really interesting to hear Nova Scotia and PEI and New Brunswick have such a diverse uh, different dialects. And then when we got to St. John's, I was just blown away because it was a whole different twang to the language that you really do have to, like you said, fine tune your ears. It's not just, it doesn't come like that right away. You really need to listen. But
Yeah,
once you
that's a
once you get it, you get it.
yeah, yeah, exactly. That's
Yeah,
the fun part. It would be boring if everybody sounded the same all the time.
yeah, exactly. And I was so fortunate to be able to do that in my teenage years. It was one of the few things I did as a teenager that I did like as an Acadian, I guess. Because other than that, I
Yes.
mostly identified as an Anglophone. But my father's last name is Savoy, so I'm definitely, Savoy Savoy. I can't
You're on that
deny,
list.
yeah, I can't deny that. So it's definitely something that as I got older, the more I started connecting with people in my province through my work, it really piqued my interest. Is what does this mean to be an Acadian? And that my original thought of what an Acadian was growing up was really skewed because of my mother's perception of what an Acadian is. So
I mean, there was a time the Acadians were the poor ones who didn't get good jobs and never would have seen themselves in a job like yours today. So, I mean, it didn't have, I mean, it's like all kinds of different people from different places have those kind of stories that, you don't want to identify with a group that's always struggling or are the poor ones or whatever. So, yeah, you can understand it. It's just that it doesn't help.
no, but I'm definitely proud to be from a generation that doesn't associate those negative things with being an Acadian. And I don't feel my children will ever have any negative emotions tied to it, right? For them, it will always just be a cool thing. Like I have an Acadian heritage.
Yes, exactly. I
And
know my son, whether or not he wanted to, because when I started at Grand Prix, he was a teenager, and so he's gotten more than his share of Acadian stuff. So he can't escape it, and he doesn't want to. It's a real thing. So that's lovely.
yeah, and I do understand that it's up to us to kind of be the ambassadors of Acadian culture and to through interviews like tonight, that's a way to share stories. And I'm going to use this information to share the story again. And um, it's, education, sharing stories and educating people on what Acadians are and the different experiences and how your experience is very different from the experience of someone, even in Nova Scotia today, of just a different generation, right?
Yeah,
But I think
totally.
it's really important to capture that. So I have a lot of people that have shown interest in having some interviews done. So I'm feeling almost a little overwhelmed at this point. I have like 20 people from across North America that I need to organize some interviews with. But it's good. It's
It's all
really,
right. Yeah, that's how I do it when I research. I just gather up all the information, and eventually it fits.
yeah.
Yeah.
So I'm going to be interviewing some folks from Louisiana next to hear their perspective and some folks from Maine as well.
That'll be different again because they're Americans. So they're living in a whole different context than we are,
Yeah,
even though we're all in North America,
and
but that society is ours.
I had already done an interview with someone from a little Canada in Massachusetts, and completely different experience than what I was expecting when I asked the questions. It was only ever a great experience for them growing up in terms of what a wonderful community they had and that the language was very much alive in their community growing up and there was um a lot of pride, right? Whereas I know in Maine it's very different. They weren't allowed to speak French. So I'm really curious to be able to compare that way and uh, just to hear how it's influenced people's careers as well, and helped people develop into who they are today. Like it's influenced you obviously you wrote a book about it. So, you know, that's a big deal. Not everyone not everyone writes a book. So, um, and to be able to write a book about your history and your personal story too is it takes even more passion, I think, because
Definitely.
it's coming from a
Yeah.
personal place. So that would be, to me, would have been my biggest struggle, would have been writing a book.
Well, it took me 20 years, so you know, life happens in between.
Yeah. Well, I understand that things take time. It took me 5 years to finish my master's of education because I had to keep putting it on hold every time something was going on at work or had a baby. That kind of caused some problems there. So I had to put some work on hold. Yeah,
That's life.
exactly. So I'm going to use some of this research hopefully towards, like I had mentioned previously, working towards either my doctorate or my PhD, but that's something that I know isn't going to be for probably like another decade or something. But I'm fine with that because this research is something that's important to me, and I feel like it's going to be useful for my courses to help me build off of that. And I have a professor that's willing to help me with it, and they're an experienced person, and I don't know if they're going to be available to help me in 10 years. So, you know, when I'm actually ready to
It will
move on.
all work out.
Yeah. So
It'll
thank
all work out.
yeah,
Let it go. Yeah, do your thing. You do you, and it all fits in.
yeah. I don't have I don't wish for time to rush by. So,
And sometimes I know when I was writing my book, I, I wrote like the first part because we know about Annapolis Royal and the life here uh, before the deportation, and I wrote the last part because we know about where what happened after the deportation. But in our story, it was always we were not deported, so it's kind of a black hole of 5 years. What? Well, how do you survive for 5 years in the woods of New Brunswick? And just as I was getting to the point of putting it together and saying I have a hole, I ran into recently published reports by Randy Gilles Leblanc in particular, who was a Parks Canada historian, and he just filled in so many of the pieces that were missing that really no one seemed to have that information. So sometimes stuff just comes to you when you need it.
yeah, I definitely believe that stuff comes to you when you need it. When things happen
Yeah,
when you need it to happen. So,
yeah.
so thank you so much for taking the time to meet with me tonight. I appreciate it, and I hope you have a great rest of your week. And I'll probably be in touch through email just to reach out to let you know what my next moves are and just to keep you posted.
Perfect. It was a pleasure. I always like to talk about Acadian stuff in my book and all of that anyway. So that was
Yeah.
perfect. Have a good night.
All right. Well, thank you so much. Au revoir. À la prochaine.
À la prochaine.